He gave his coat to a starving Highland girl. By dawn, 800 archers had surrounded his smokehouse. The wind howled down from the high country, sweeping over the hills like a living thing. It rattled the weathered boards of Coldwater Hollow, a town so forgotten even the rail line had given it a wide berth. Snow clung to the sides of rough-hewn buildings, burying wagons up to their spokes and drifting knee-deep against shuttered doors. A single lantern hung outside the hollow's only saloon, its flames struggling against the night, while the rest of the town huddled in darkness. Even the wolves, somewhere out in the timber, had grown silent. Elijah Rourke stood alone near the edge of the street, his back pressed against the side of the mercantile. A battered hat shadowed his face, though the sharp wind had etched the years into his skin with merciless hands. Snowflakes settled in the hollows of his beard, and his gray eyes, pale as stormlit skies, watched the empty street without blinking. The townsfolk knew him as a man who kept to himself, who spoke little and asked for less, content to tend his smokehouse beyond the outskirts, where the land rose into bare, wind-scoured hills. There were rumors about Rourke, as there always were about men who didn't fit neatly into town stories, but no one dared voice them within his earshot. The silence of the street broke then, and every window curtain in Coldwater Hollow twitched as a figure stumbled into view. A girl, thin as a fence post, half dragging her feet through the snow. Her long hair, a tangle of black and copper, clung to her face in frozen strands. The dress she wore was little more than rags, the hem stiff with ice. A crimson plaid shawl, faded but still defiant in its color, was clutched around her shoulders. The townsfolk watched from behind their shutters. In this part of the territory, strangers meant trouble, and a Highland girl, the old tartan marked her plainly enough, meant more than that. Word traveled fast in these parts, and folks spoke in low voices of the Red Veil Riders, of what they did to Highland refugees found too far from the mountains. The girl staggered, her lips blue, her breath a white ghost on the air, and fell to her knees in the snow at the center of the street. No one moved. The saloon's door cracked open a hand's width, and old Isaiah Varn peered out, his lined face pinched tight with something between fear and contempt. "Let her freeze," he muttered to no one in particular. "Ain't worth bringing hell down on us." A few muttered agreements followed from unseen mouths. Lantern light caught on the girl's face as she lifted her head. Blue eyes, sharp as fresh-cut ice, stared back at the windows she knew were watching. There was no pleading in them, no begging, only the raw, stubborn defiance of someone who'd run too far and lost too much to kneel to any man now. Rourke stepped away from the mercantile. The crunch of his boots in the snow was the only sound. He crossed the street without hurry, his long coat trailing behind him, and came to stand before the girl. She didn't flinch, nor did she lower her gaze. The wind shrieked past them both, tugging at her ragged hair. Without a word, Elijah shrugged off his coat. It was heavy wool, dyed the dull brown of old earth, patched at the elbows, and lined with thick fleece. The kind of garment a man couldn't replace out here once the snows came down. He knelt, his knees sinking into the drift, and draped the coat over the girl's shoulders. His hands, broad and scarred, lingered a moment longer than necessity required. Then he stood, turning his gaze to the shuttered windows. One by one, the lanterns behind those curtains winked out. Isla Macrae, though she did not know yet what claim the man had to such defiance, rose to her feet beneath the weight of the coat. It dwarfed her, trailing behind in the snow. She staggered once, caught herself, and then followed Elijah without a word as he made his way down the street. Not toward the saloon, nor the church, but out past the last hitching post, toward the hills where only the desperate or the mad made their homes. The smokehouse squatted at the base of a low ridge, its walls blackened with years of fire smoke and weather. A thin curl of steam rose from the chimney, the scent of cured venison and pine pitch lingering in the air. Rourke pushed the door open and stepped aside. Inside, the single room was sparse. A rough table, a bedroll by the hearth, and hooks along the beams where strips of meat hung drying. An oil lamp sputtered on a shelf. The girl hesitated, casting a glance over her shoulder as though she could feel the eyes watching from the darkness. She crossed the threshold and stood with her back to the door, blue eyes steady. Elijah took a slab of dried meat from a hook, broke it in half, and set both pieces on a wooden plate. He poured water from a crock into a tin cup, set that beside the plate, then pushed them toward her across the table. Still he said nothing. His face gave nothing away, save for the restless flicker of old, unspoken memories behind his gaze. Isla sat. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the cup, and the warmth of the water seemed to strike through her like a blow. She ate without ceremony, gnawing at the meat until the ache in her stomach dulled to something bearable. The lamp cast long, unsteady shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind shifted. High above the hollow, on the ridge where the pines grew crooked and close, figures moved. Shadows too tall for trees, too silent for animals. Eyes gleamed faintly in the moonlight, and somewhere a hawk gave a single, echoing cry before silence reclaimed the night. Rourke stood by the hearth, feeding another log to the flames. He did not ask the girl's name. He did not speak of the town's fear, nor of the riders. He watched the window instead, as though waiting for something only he could see. At last, the girl spoke. Her voice was hoarse, a threadbare rasp. "You'll bring them down on you." Elijah's lips quirked, the closest thing he had to a smile. "Let them come." The words hung in the air like smoke. Neither spoke again. The fire cracked and hissed. The snow continued to fall outside, thick and endless. And in the distance, beyond where the lanterns of Coldwater Hollow had already gone dark, the hills watched with ancient, patient eyes. The snow fell heavier by the hour, thickening into a curtain that blurred the world beyond the windowpane. Inside the smokehouse, the fire crackled and snapped, chasing back the cold, but it couldn't soften the weight in the room. The girl sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, Elijah's coat still around her shoulders. Her eyes never left the flame, though her mind was far from its flickering light. Elijah sat opposite, a knife in one hand, whittling at a length of pine, though the shavings gathered untouched at his feet. His gaze drifted now and again to the girl, noting the straightness of her spine, despite the hunger in her face, the way her jaw set when the wind howled outside. He recognized it, the mark of a soul who'd already lost too much to flinch at what came next. It was she who broke the silence. "My name's Isla Macrae." Elijah's hand paused mid-stroke. He said nothing, but the name curled through the air like smoke. "My father," she went on, voice soft but steady, "was Lachlan Macrae, Laird's blood, though there's no Laird to speak of anymore. He taught me to string a bow before I was tall enough to draw it, taught me the words of the old tongue, told me what we were." Her gaze lifted to meet Elijah's. Descendants of the Highland archers, banished, scattered across these hills when the Empire came. But we remembered. The blood remembers. The wind shrieked, slamming against the walls. "They came for us last spring. The riders. Said my father had to kneel, swear allegiance to Cain's mark. Said there was no law but their law." He spat at their feet. A flicker of fierce pride crossed her face, sharp enough to cut. "They hung him from the ash tree by the creek. Made me watch. Burned the croft. Said I was next." Elijah's grip tightened on the hilt of his knife. The shadows from the fire caught the faint gleam of something around his neck. A thin chain, half hidden beneath his collar, from which hung a ring, old silver, the pattern worn but still clear. A Celtic knot, endless and unbroken. His thumb rubbed across it now as memory stirred. Another land, another winter. Smoke curling from longhouses, the air thick with the scent of pine and blood. Arrows arcing in black clouds across a moonless sky. The clash of steel on steel. Men with the same tartan as this girl, fighting for a cause long buried beneath snow and time. He had once borne a different name, spoken words in a different tongue. But death and exile could strip a man of many things, save the vows written in his blood. The moment passed, and the fire snapped sharply, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. In town, unease churned like a storm tide. The saloon's backroom, cramped and low-ceilinged, was packed with every soul still brave enough to call themselves a man of Coldwater Hollow. Josiah Varn leaned over the table, a bottle clenched in one bony fist. "She's brought a curse down on us, same as her kind always do." He spat. The Red Veil Riders'll be here by dawn. Kane's got 50 men, maybe more. He raised Dry Creek for less than this. You remember what they left hanging from the church steeple?" A grumble of assent rippled through the room. "We give her up," said Marshal Deeks, his badge tarnished and askew on his coat. "Simple as that. Wash our hands clean. Ain't our fight." A few nodded, their faces lined with fear. None spoke up for the girl. Then the door creaked open, and Elijah Rourke stepped inside. The room fell to a hush. The old widower, the Smokehouse hermit, had not darkened the saloon's threshold in over a year. He took in the gathered men, with a glance sharp as a drawn blade. "No," was all he said. Josiah's lip curled. "Ain't your call, Rourke." Elijah stepped closer, voice low, the edge of steel in it. "You give that girl over, and it won't save this town. Kane burns what he wants, takes what he wants. She's just the excuse this time." "She's a curse," someone muttered. Elijah's gaze swept the room. "I've known curses. This ain't one." Outside, the snow piled higher, and a wolf's mournful cry drifted in from the hills. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. No man there wanted the riders on their doorstep. No man wanted Rourke's trouble either. Finally, Deeks raised his hands. "You do what you like, old man, but don't come looking for our help when Kane rides through." "I won't," Elijah said, already turning away. Back in the smokehouse, Outlaw stood as he entered. The defiance in her gaze wavered for the first time. "They'll come for me." He nodded. "Aye, and they'll find more than they're hunting." The storm howled louder, rattling the shutters. "You should run," she said quietly. Elijah stepped to the hearth, took down an oilskin-wrapped bundle from a high shelf, and laid it on the table. Inside was a bough, old, the wood dark with age but lovingly tended. A quiver of black-fletched arrows accompanied it. "I ran once," he said, almost to himself. "Not again." He pulled the chain from around his neck, the ring catching the firelight. Islaw's breath caught. She knew the knot. Every Highland child did. The mark of the Blood Oath clans. Her father had worn one. Every man at the old Gather Oaths had borne the same. "You're one of us." Rourke didn't answer. He slung the bow over his shoulder, buckled a short sword to his belt, and stepped toward the door. "I have to go." Outlaw moved after him. "Where?" His hand touched her shoulder, firm but not unkind. "You'll know by dawn." And with that, he slipped into the storm. The wind swallowed him whole. Outlaw stood alone, the crackle of the fire the only sound now. The snow battered the windows, and the storm sang its ancient song. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out once, sharp and clear. The snow swallowed Elijah Rourke as he left the smokehouse behind, the wind tearing at his coat, biting through wool and leather as though seeking to strip the flesh beneath. The night stretched vast and endless before him, a landscape of pale drifts and jagged black branches, the skeletal remains of trees reaching upward like the broken fingers of dead men. Few dared the hills after nightfall. Fewer still returned. But Rourke moved with the certainty of one who knew every turn, every stone, every marker the land offered to those who could read its old, silent language. He climbed the first ridge, boots breaking through crusted snow, the bow slung across his back, and the ring heavy in his pocket. The moon, low and blood-bright, slipped through ragged clouds, painting the snowfields in eerie crimson hues. Every now and then, a lone pine creaked under the weight of ice, and somewhere far off, a wolf's call broke the hush, only to be devoured by the storm's howl. Elijah reached the canyon's edge, a narrow cut in the hills, its mouth marked by a toppled cairn, its stones half buried in snow. Few alive now remembered what the old markers meant. Fewer still had built them. Rourke paused, resting a hand on the highest stone, and for a long moment he let the wind scream past him. He stepped into the cleft. Within the narrow canyon, the world changed. The storms roared dull to a muffled hush, and the snow lay undisturbed, untouched by man or beast. Here the trees grew close and crooked, their trunks twisted by centuries of winter. Elijah passed beneath a dead branch where an ancient length of faded tartan still clung, frozen stiff. The bloodlines of the old clans, scattered and hunted, had marked this path for those who would remember. At the canyon's end, the walls widened into a hidden glen, ringed by towering pines, whose tops clawed at the storm-churned sky. A single fire burned there, low and watchful, banked beneath a ring of stones. Around it, figures waited, motionless as stone, their shapes blurred by cloaks and shadow. Elijah stepped into the circle of light. "Long years," came a voice, old and cracked but carrying a weight no age could soften. The speaker stepped forward. Malcolm Ruaid, his hair silver, his face lined deep as the ridges of these hills, still carried a bow across his back. His eyes, the pale blue of winter ice, fixed on Rourke. "Longer still," Elijah answered. The language was the old tongue now, worn smooth by time, but it fit in his mouth like a blade in a familiar hand. One by one, the others revealed themselves. Men and women, gray of hair and hardened by years, their faces weathered, eyes sharp. Some had been young when the last gather oaths were sworn. Some had buried their own beneath stones like the one at the canyon mouth. But all still bore the marks, a woven band on the wrist, a knotwork brooch, a length of faded tartan. Malcolm gave a slight nod. "We thought you dead, Satyr Dub." The name hung in the air, thick with old blood and broken vows. "I was," Rourke said quietly, "or near enough. But the blood never forgets." He stepped closer to the fire, letting the heat find his skin, and drew from his coat the worn silver ring, holding it up so the light caught the knotwork. A murmur rippled through the gathered archers. The ring of Satyr Dub, the black archer, was a relic of oaths made and debts unpaid. "She's Lachlan Macrae's blood," Elijah said, voice carrying to every ear, even those that had thought themselves deaf to such things. "The riders murder her kin, hunted her into the snows, and the men of Coldwater Hollow would see her given to Cain before dawn." A growl of anger rippled through the gathering. "I remember," Elijah went on, eyes never leaving the fire, "when we swore we'd never let another of our blood die alone. I remember what we promised when the Empire burned the old lands and left us to rot in these hills. I remember when oaths meant something." A long silence followed. Malcolm's hand tightened on the grip of his bow. Around the fire, others did the same. Weathered faces turned toward one another, wordless decisions passing in shared glances. The wind moaned high in the trees, and the snow fell in thick, soundless sheets. At last, Malcolm spoke. "Then we gather." Without another word, the old archer kicked snow over the fire. Darkness claimed the glen. Shapes moved through the snow, breaking open long-wrapped bundles, unstringing bows, and stringing them anew. Quivers were slung over shoulders, knives checked, war paint smeared in dark streaks across pale skin. Silent as ghosts, the Highland blood prepared. Elijah bent beside a stone, unwrapping his own bundle. The bough within was older than most men in the glen, but its curve was true, the string new, the grip worn smooth by his hand alone. He ran his fingers along the wood, feeling old memories stir, then slipped the ring onto his finger once more. Above them, the clouds tore aside for a brief instant, and a lone hawk circled overhead, its cry a single, cutting note in the night. Elijah looked up, his eyes finding its shadowed wings against the blood-moon sky. "By dawn," he murmured. Without signal or shouted word, the archers vanished into the trees, fading into the storm. The snow claimed the glen once more, leaving only the cold and the long-forgotten weight of oaths reborn. Dawn broke blood-red over Coldwater Hollow. The storm had spent itself in the dark hours, leaving a brittle, icy stillness in its wake. Snow lay deep and untouched, a cold shroud over the land. Smoke curled thinly from chimneys, though not a soul moved in the streets. Doors were bolted, curtains drawn tight. The town held its breath. At the edge of the clearing, the smokehouse stood solitary against the pale sky. Isla Macrae stood before it, Elijah's heavy coat still wrapped around her narrow shoulders. The wool hung to her ankles, its weight both a burden and a shield. Her hands were bare, knuckles raw from the cold, but she held her chin high, the same stubborn defiance burning in her sharp blue eyes. The first sound came from the east, the low, steady drum of hooves and snow. 40 riders came down from the hills, their figures black against the glare of morning ice. They rode without haste, cruel faces half hidden behind crimson scarves. The Red Veil Riders. Coldwater's curse made flesh. At their head rode Maddox Kane, a tall, broad-shouldered brute with a wolf-pelt cloak and a scar that split one side of his face like a lightning bolt. The riders reined in before the smokehouse, horses snorting, steam billowing from their nostrils. Kane's eyes settled on the girl. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice thick with satisfaction. "Thought you could run to dirt farmers and woodcutters, did you? Thought maybe the snow'd keep me from you." Isla said nothing. The townsfolk's silence pressed in from every shuttered window, their absence a stain more vivid than any blood. Kane swung down from his saddle and took a slow step forward, a cruel grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I gave that town fair warning," he said, raising his voice so it would carry. "Hand over the McCrae brat, or I burn it to ash." Isla took one step closer, the hem of the coat dragging through the snow. "You burned my kin," she said, her voice clear and fierce. "Strung my father up like a dog. Swore an oath to these hills, and you broke it. You're no leader. You're no blood of ours." A few of the riders shifted uneasily in their saddles. Kane's smile withered. "Girl," he growled, drawing his saber, "I should cut your tongue out and feed it to my dogs." He raised the blade, the early sun catching on its edge. Then a sharp hiss cut through the air. An arrow struck the snow at Kane's feet, burying itself to the fletching. A heartbeat's pause. Another hiss. Another arrow. Then a third. Quivering a hand spanned from the second. Kane froze, his gaze snapping to the tree-line beyond the town. From every side, the hills, the rooftops, the shadows between buildings, figures emerged. Cloaked in snow-dusted wool, faces marked with soot and war paint, bows drawn and aimed. A wall of archers. Hundreds. No more. 800 men and women of Highland blood, risen from the snows like shades of the old world. Their breath smoked in the cold, the faint creak of tightened bowstrings the only sound. Kane's men shifted, alarm rippling through their ranks. Hands went to pistol grips, blades half-drawn. A single voice broke the hush. "You swore once, Kane." Elijah Rourke stepped from the shadows of a narrow alley, bow in hand, the ring on his finger gleaming like a drop of frost. The years hung heavy on him, but his eyes were cold and sharp as a whetted knife. Kane spat. "I should have killed you long ago, Rourke." "You tried," Elijah said softly. "And you failed." He raised his hand. The archers drew as one. 800 arrows lifted skyward, their points catching the rising light like a crown of thorns. Kane's bravado cracked. "You think you'll live through this?" "Not the question," Rourke murmured. "The question is whether you'll see another breath." For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. The snow stifled every sound, save for the low, ragged breathing of frightened horses. Then one of Kane's men bolted. His mount turned, fleeing for the hills. It was enough. Kane turned to follow, spurring his horse, the other riders breaking formation in a panic, their formation collapsing like rotted wood. But the hills were no refuge now. Arrows sang down in a storm of death. Horses screamed. Men fell where they fled. Kane's horse thundered through the chaos, but already Rourke was moving. He knocked a single black-fletched arrow, drew it back to his ear. Time seemed to stretch. The arrow flew. It struck Kane squarely between the shoulders, driving him from the saddle. He fell into the snow, his blood blooming bright against the white. Silence followed. Not a rider remained upright. The Highlanders lowered their bows. Slowly, one by one, the townsfolk emerged from their homes, eyes wide, shame heavy on their faces. No one spoke. The smokehouse yard, once heavy with fear, now stood beneath the full light of dawn, awash in red and gold. Isla stepped to Elijah's side, and for the first time, her defiance gave way to something softer. The archers bowed their heads. The old blood had risen, and the snows would remember. The sun rose higher, melting the edges of the blood-dark snow, its warmth a thin, half-hearted promise against the weight of what had passed. The smokehouse yard lay quiet now, strewn with broken shafts and boot prints soon to be swallowed by fresh snow. Maddox Kane's body was gone, carried off by men with downcast eyes who would speak his name only in curses from now on. The last of the Red Veil riders were dead, scattered, or fled far enough into the hills to never be seen again. And the archers, the Highland blood, the ghosts from the old oaths, had vanished with the dawn. They melted into the snowbound hills as though they'd never been, leaving no tracks, no sound, no sign save for the faintest scent of wood smoke lingering in the pines. The ridgeline swallowed them, those 800 quiet warriors, and whether they returned to their hidden glens or simply to the earth itself, no one in Coldwater Hollow would say for certain. Legends do not linger where men might catch them by the sleeve. The town folk emerged one by one, shame clinging to them heavier than the cold. Faces pale, lips pinched, their courage spent long before the snow had been stained red. They crossed the churned yard toward Isla and Elijah Rourke, their eyes averted, voices rough with something like guilt. Josiah Varn was first, hat in hand, ringing it like a penitent schoolboy. "We were wrong," he said, the words coming brittle and slow. "It wasn't right, turning our backs on you, girl. Or you, Rourke." Isla stood tall, Elijah's coat still about her shoulders, and for a moment her sharp blue eyes gleamed like fresh-forged steel. Then she gave a short nod. "Not your forgiveness I need," she answered, though there was no venom in it, only tired truth. "But you'll not make the same mistake again." The others muttered their apologies, awkward words tumbling over one another, and then, as if by unspoken agreement, they drifted back to their homes. The hollow had bled this morning, and wounds like that leave their marks, even if the scars are carried in silence. Later, by the smokehouse hearth, Isla laid a clean stone before the fire and scratched a name into it with the tip of Elijah's old skinning knife. Lachlan MacCrae. She set it upright on the mantel, next to a length of woven tartan and a slender arrow fletched in black. A simple shrine for a father, a clan, and a vow kept. Elijah watched from his chair, bow laid across his lap. His fingers brushed the worn grip once, tracing the old nicks and the weathered wood grain. It had seen its last arrow loosed that dawn. He stood, walked to the mantel, and hung the bow on a pair of pegs above the hearth. Beside it, he set one arrow, the last of its quiver, its shaft straight and dark, its fletching midnight black. "That's enough of that," he murmured. Isla looked up from the fire. "You'll not need it again?" Rourke gave a faint smile. "If I do, the hills will answer before my hand can." And with those words, the years seemed to settle on his shoulders a little easier. Coldwater Hollow changed in small ways after that. Folks walked with a touch more humility in their step, and no one dared speak ill of Highland blood again, not while the snows still lay thick on the ridges. A stranger might have noticed the way townsfolk would pause, casting a wary eye to the hills when the wind blew a certain way, or when a hawk wheeled high in a cloudless sky, as though remembering that oaths, once made in blood and storm, never truly faded. Isla claimed the smokehouse as her home, alongside Rourke. She spoke of leaving once, to see the old lands her father had told her of, but in time, she found she belonged more to these hills than to stories half a world away. She learned to cure meat, to track a storm by the curl of the wind, to read the silence in the snow. In the long winters, Rourke taught her the old tongue, and together they spoke names long lost to the world beyond the mountains. And when spring finally came, it was Isla MacCrae who stood tallest at the town's gather, her voice steady as she spoke her father's name and claimed her place among the people of the hollow. Some claimed to see Rourke in the hills from time to time, walking the ridges with a hawk at his shoulder, though no man could say for sure. The bough above the hearth gathered dust, but the arrow remained untouched, a promise unbroken. They say legends die, but that's a lie folks tell themselves to sleep easier. Legends live where oaths are kept, where coats are given to starving girls, where arrows fall in snow, and men remember who they once were. The hills remember. The snow remembers. And if you look to the sky at dusk, you might catch sight of a lone hawk circling high, carrying on its wings the echo of a vow made long ago. Some things are never lost.